Hello, I'm Jo Coburn. Welcome to Building the Green Consensus, brought to you by Project Syndicate with support from the European Investment Bank and European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. There are now only 6 governments around the world who are yet to ratify the Paris Agreement, the landmark treaty committing the world to drastic action against soaring global temperatures. A consensus then emerging on the need for action. But can we find agreement on what that action actually looks like? Well, we're here today to find out. And over the next 3 hours, we'll be consulting, amongst others, with Jeffrey Sachs, Director of the Centre for Sustainable Development at Columbia University; Omar Razaz, former Prime Minister of Jordan; Werner Hoyer, the President of the European Investment Bank; Odile Renaud-Basso, President of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development; Erion Veliai is the Mayor of Tirana; and Kenneth Rogoff, Professor of Economics at Harvard University. And if you'd like to help out, we'd love to hear from you. Please share your ideas on the hashtag Building the Green Consensus. In just a few moments, we'll be coming to our first panel of the day, asking what can be done to end our use of fossil fuels without causing economic devastation. Will we find a consensus amongst our panelists? But to kick things off today, here's Jeffrey Sachs, Director of the Centre for Sustainable Development at Columbia University.
We are close to the consensus that we need, though we still don't quite have the consensus and we don't have the actions needed for climate safety. I'd like to make 6 very quick points. We should know what to do because we have had authoritative reports of the IPCC Working Group 1, which says we're in such a mess. We absolutely have to take decisive action to head off climate disaster. And we've seen climate disaster all around us in 2021. And we've had the report of the International Energy Agency, which says it's possible to get to net zero by 2050 worldwide.
The European Green Deal is Europe's new growth strategy.
The European Green Deal is a holistic and comprehensive framework, and it is especially powerful because it combines decarbonization with sustainable land use, because this is an energy and land use challenge. Stop financing of fossil fuel projects. Is that so complicated? We do not need new pipelines, new coal mines, new exploration and development of oil and gas. We've got more than enough fossil fuels. We have to leave the fossil fuels under the ground. A coherent strategy is a holistic approach to both mitigation and adaptation. In other words, we have to stop the human-induced climate change as rapidly as possible, but we also must live adequately with the climate change that is already in train and that will be with us throughout this century. We're seeing disasters all over the world: mega forest fires, floods, droughts, intense hurricanes. The challenge will get worse. We must be ready. Climate justice has to run through all of our programs as we mitigate and adapt to climate change. Environmental management in the past has been racist. It has been discriminatory. It has hit the poor the hardest. It has hit particular regions the hardest. But we need an approach based on social justice. Now, it's a shame that the rich countries promised a dozen years ago that they would provide at least $100 billion per year of financing for the developing countries for climate action. That's not much money, by the way. It's a small amount of money and a small fraction of what's needed. But so far, the rich countries haven't even come up with the $100 billion, much less actually the financing of trillions. Some of that big money will be direct private financing in privately owned projects, but a lot requires large-scale public financing. And I want to emphasize the crucial role of the multilateral development banks, like the partners, EBRD and EIB. They have an essential, I would say, a unique role to play in financing the energy transition. We need, in the coming months, to agree worldwide to a massive increase of paid-in capital and other means to scale up the multilateral development bank financing of climate action. Developing countries need low-cost, fixed interest rate, long-term maturity financing in order to invest in the zero-carbon energy systems and in climate safety and resilience. This is part of the unfinished consensus that needs to be built. Thank you again for including me in this important conference. I know that the discussions will be fascinating and indeed will help us to build that vitally important consensus.
Jeffrey Sachs there. Now, I'm delighted to introduce the panel for our first session of the day. Pascal Canfin, MEP and Chair of the European Parliament Committee on the Environment, Public Health and Food Safety. Thierry Deshaux, CEO of Meridiam. Mafalda Duarte, CEO of Climate Investment Funds. And Kenneth Rogoff, Professor of Economics and Public Policy at Harvard University. Welcome to all of you. And we'll come to them in just a moment. But first, let's remind ourselves of the issue.
Coal is still the largest single employer in Wales.
Machinery of a sophistication undreamed of. 3/4 of this coal goes to generate electricity.
Code Red for Humanity, the wake-up call from the United Nations. What could happen if humans do not aggressively change?
They're all taking our jobs, folks. I'm gonna put the miners back to work.
Now, before we get started, just one more reminder that if you'd like to join the conversation or help share the word today, we'd be delighted. Get involved using the hashtag #BuildingTheGreenConsensus. Now, in about half an hour, we'll be taking questions to the panel from journalists from around the world. But let me start, first of all, by taking the temperature on the level of consensus we have amongst our first panel today, and start by making a series of statements. Now, as soon as any of you disagree, please put up your hand. I'll be trying to watch you. So, the first statement: billions of people around the world currently rely on fossil fuels. Everyone seems to agree with that. We could not stop burning fossil fuels tomorrow without catastrophic costs in both lives and livelihoods. Again, consensus. Government help is necessary to phase them out. At the very least, there should be no public subsidy of fossil fuels. Anyone disagree? Okay, we have consensus on those four statements. So I'm going to ask Kenneth to take a look at this in particular. It's a map. Almost 1 billion people across developing economies still don't have access to electricity of any kind. So Kenneth, do rich Western nations have a problem telling these countries that they can't have electricity if it isn't renewable?
Well, absolutely. It's towering hypocrisy. And I think underscoring something that Professor Sachs said at the outset, and we need to think about social justice in this. You can't say, well, we're consuming gas and coal and oil, but yeah, we built that stuff and we just want to use it. But if you want, you have to use water and wind. I think there's really, this is much bigger really than just environmental social justice. It's much broader than that. But if you don't stop the greater pollution coming from the developing world, particularly Asia, nothing's going to help. So there really needs to be a rethink more broadly of the economic contract, not just the environment.
Right. Well, so Kenneth, what would your suggestion be in terms of helping developing parts of the world to give up some fossil fuels without looking like hypocrites?
Well, I mean, I think we need to focus in on things that can happen. And one suggestion I've made, and there are variations of this, is to have a World Carbon Bank run in a way parallel maybe to the way the World Bank and the IMF is, but very focused, that would channel funds, let's call them $100, $200 billion a year, to countries, particularly in Asia, to phase out their coal plants. They have coal plants they're building still, I think, one a week. And the average age of the coal plants in Asia is maybe 12 years, something like that. The lifespan's 50. And it's very easy for us in the West to say, let's phase out our coal plants. They're all practically 50 years old already. So I think that's really a starting point. And a vehicle like that could be used to transmit technical expertise. And I full well recognize some of this can be done within the existing development banks, but they have a lot of other things going on. This is so big, I think we need a focused agency.
All right. Well, in the spirit of consensus, continuing with that theme, Pascal, I could see you nodding away. You agree, do you, with what Kenneth said?
No, I agree. First, hello to everybody.
Hello.
Maybe we could start implementing a sort of a renewable first test when it comes to multilateral banks financing, meaning that it's true that renewables cannot match all the needs from now on in the developing countries. But if we would have a sort of renewable first test to make the analysis that, okay, in this specific case, there is no renewable, credible, cheap, cost-effective possible option, and then it means I have to switch to something else, then at least we would make sure that if we keep on financing fossil projects in the developing countries, and I'm only talking about in developing countries, then it would be justified because current alternatives are not available or enough credible, I would say, from a technical and economic.
Right, well, that's interesting. Well, that's interesting. Faldo, do you agree with that? Because your organisation has invested billions in clean energy projects around the world. How long do you think it'll be before all new energy projects are going green?
So I agree. I think there are some points that Kenneth made and Pascal made that are right. I think we need pretty dedicated finance and public finance to come into developing countries and support them with this massive task of phasing out from coal. There's one key difference between developed countries and developing countries, which is in developed countries, it's already making sense to phase out from coal. There are studies out there that shows that there would be net savings in developed countries. In developing countries, partly because of what Kenneth said, the life of these power plants, but for other reasons as well. In most of these countries, there are net costs, and it's not just about the coal phase-out agenda is complex. It's not just about the power sector; it's about the mining sector, and that's a really important sector, and where a lot of the social costs will be borne. But in terms of the renewable energy, there has to be in tandem massive efforts to support new renewable energy generation and to de-risk the private sector investments in those renewable energy projects. So these things, in fact, in a lot of the countries, what needs to happen, there has to be right now a massive ramp up of renewable energy investments, so that when the coal is phased out, you can actually meet demand. But there's also a need for, as I said, there's a need to look at these issues. It's not just about power generation and phasing out from coal in terms of the power sector. It's about all of the other infrastructure that is needed around the power sector, the transmission, the capability of the systems to absorb all of this intermittent renewable energy. It's about the communities and the workers.
All right. I mean, Thierry, it sounds like it's all going to cost vast amounts of money. Where's all that going to come from?
Well, the money is available. It's just the channel to get the money to the right place, which is slightly complicated. But there is high demand amongst investors for these type of investments. And I mean, obviously, there is still quite a few obstacles. First is creating those investments, because these projects, building solar power plants or any other renewable power plants, it means human resources to actually achieve quite a number of things, authorizations, approvals, and these are the things that are usually the biggest hurdle in terms of project being prepared to be invested. So I'm not too concerned about the money. I mean, the positive spin that I see is perhaps less exciting for fossil fuels, because coal is not the issue of all emerging markets. A number of them are just using heavy fuel at the moment. Is the possibility, the need that they have to increase their capacity substantially, and that capacity can come from renewable energy. But I was just said, you can't imagine tripling capacity with renewable energy without thinking about network grid and storage capacity. And today, technologies are really helping us support this growth. And I think to think of it as exiting coal or fossil fuels, we need in parallel to look at the positive spin, which is grow capacity in emerging markets with renewable, but simultaneously with grid and storage.
Right. Well, Pascal, Thierry is not worried particularly about the money. So, I mean, just give us a sense of, how far is Europe from phasing out fossil fuels, and how much money is it going to take?
Well, when you look at the figures, in many cases, anyway, we need more investment, either in the developing world to create the new facilities and the new networks, or in the developed world and countries to replace the massive part of the infrastructure that have been built after the World War II, to make it a bit simplistic. In any case, we are in a world where we need to invest more in the energy sector, and even more in the power generation sector, because we are going to massively electrify our mobility. And for instance, in Europe, as you might know, among the Green Deal regulation, and you just mentioned the Green Deal in your introduction, we are going to change more than 50 laws at the same time. One of them is to put an end to fossil cars. So fossil powered cars, whether they are from diesel or from gasoline. It's in 2035. So we have 12 or 13 years to change the whole mobility sector in Europe. And it means more power generation and less petrol, less gas. So we are doing it. And it means that we are going to invest more. But again, you said it will be costly. It will be costly. But non-action, inaction, will be even more costly and will be even more unfair for these countries. So please do not compare cost of action in the green transition and business as usual, because business as usual does not exist.
Can I get your reaction to what you've heard? Perhaps also picking up the point from Mafalda about the social costs of phasing out fossil fuels and the transition to more green energy projects.
I thought Mafalda made a really good point there, that we have to think of the social costs as there's a big changes in these societies. Coal is readily found in India and China, and it's not everywhere, but in many places, and it's a big part of the job. So it's a big transition moving away from it. And I tried to make the point that this is much broader than just dealing with the environment. if I might say something provocative, since we have so much consent, I'm no expert on this. My colleagues here work on this every day. They know much more than I do. But since we're making this, incredible transition, which involves a lot of things like materials, when you really scale up wind and all the non-renewables, it's very substantial. I've never seen a fully satisfactory explanation, again, it's not my expertise, of why nuclear has been taken off the table. Small things like power submarines and things like that are not weapons grade. Why is this like what is this just a core belief that it just couldn't be a good idea? But it's not obvious to me that renewables alone is really going to provide something that can give us steady enough energy that our batteries can be good enough. I realize this is very provocative, but
that's why we're debating
these great colleagues here. So I'm all ears.
Who would like to respond to that? Pascal, Thierry, yeah.
As a French citizen, I can easily agree. Well, when you look at the IPCC report, nuclear is part of the mix. So it's not taken off. I mean, from the climate science, it's part of the answer. Then when you look at the cost of nuclear energies is rising when the cost of renewables is decreasing. And even if I take, again, the French case for a second, because we have today 75% of the power generation in France is made of nuclear. And we go to 50, and even the company providing this nuclear energy called the EDF the trajectory is 30 in 2050, 30%. So it's decreasing. It's not zero, but it's decreasing. Why? Just because it is not cost effective anymore compared to renewables. So it's not taken off at all, not in the scientific debate, not in the public debate, but the vast majority of the response is based on renewables.
Kenneth, does that satisfy you?
75%, but I feel like some of the costs of nuclear is regulatory, opposition. It's in, I know in the United States, it would probably take 20 years to get a new nuclear plant approved. So I'm not convinced the costs are entirely technological. Should government be pushing in that direction?
All right, Pascal, I want you to take a look at this graph in particular from the International Renewable Energy Agency. It shows investment in renewables compared to what's needed to hit what they call the required transforming energy scenario. Where's the money going to come from for that?
Well, again, as Thierry said, I mean, the money on the market willing to be invested in green technologies, in green energies, but also for mobility and so on, is there. I mean, each time a public authority like the European Union or any sovereign, or each time a company issue a green bond, it is oversubscribed by 5, 6, 10 times. So the money is there. There is space for way additional projects in green energies before we tap the limit of the money available. So the core of the discussion here, exactly as Thierry said, is not the money which would be unavailable, is the rules of the game from public authorities to make even more incentives to go green and to raise projects from the ground, because it takes time. The cost of concrete project raising in some countries, it's too uncertain, it's too risky because of political instability and so on and so on. So that's why we are not going fast enough. But it's not a question. First, the top limit is not the money that wouldn't be available. And by the way, the fact that the central banks are going in the right directions, and like the ECB or the Bank of England or probably the Fed as well will follow soon. We are going to have a regulatory environment for investors, for the banking industry, and for the insurance companies that will incentivize even more going. So I don't think again that the core of the problem would be money unavailable.
Mafalda, you had your hand up there.
Yes, I mean, I want to say that it's true that the capital is there, but the problem is that the capital is not flowing to developing countries as it needs to flow. And as developed countries put out these intentions and signals and policies, indicating that, like the new Green Deal in Europe, there will be a lot of investment opportunities, and that's where the private capital has a preference to going to. And so I think there's a big debate here to have around how do we channel the private capital and what's the role of the public capital in enabling private capital to flow at a much larger scale into developing countries. And one shouldn't forget that developing economies are going to be running 70% of the world's energy supply. And according to the OECD, the several trillion, 90 trillion by 2030 that is needed to be invested in infrastructure, in sustainable infrastructure. 2/3 of these investments are going to happen in developing countries because that's where the infrastructure gap is. If these investments lock us into a carbon intensive future, then we are not going to be able to solve our global climate problem. So I think there has to be a focus, quite a significant focus on how do we bring public capital to enable developing countries to put in place the right policies? How do we bring public capital to de-risk the private investments that are needed? And that's precisely, right. Joe, you had mentioned earlier on, that's what we have been doing ourselves over the past 12 years. Right. Excuse me, over the past 12 years. And we have demonstrated that you actually then incentivize the private capital to go back to developing countries, even in a context of crisis, if you partner the public capital with the private capital. We were set up on the back of the last financial crisis, 2008, that's when we were established. At the time, the 8% of renewable energy, that's what existed in the whole world, and 90% of this was hydro. So there was no renewable energy to talk about in developing countries. And this public capital that G8 made available through us led to many investments, first, second, third of its kind investments in renewable energy. Yes. Right now we have 26 gigawatt of renewable energy installed capacity in our portfolio. But that public capital is needed, and the structures that were also mentioned here today, new structures. I'm a bit more doubtful about the suggestion by Kenneth of a new institution, not because I don't think that we need a dedicated effort and public capital flow to channel money into developing countries of a significant magnitude. My only concern is time. How long will it take to get a new institution up and running and really doing what we are talking about here? All right, so that's my concern.
Yeah, okay, so you're a little skeptical about Kenneth's idea of a global carbon bank, partly on timing. Thierry, what's your response to the idea of a new institution?
Yeah, I'm never keen on new institutions, actually, because it is true that they take a lot of time. And I think the existing institutions can build up a partnership and a mandate to tackle this. And clearly, I don't think we should disconnect this whole exiting carbon or fossil fuels from the major investment on the other side in renewable energy, grid, and storage. So it's together, and the institutions that are today already supporting this on the public side are doing not a bad job, but not fast enough and not enough. And perhaps to point out where the hurdles are. The hurdles are in the early stage of creating projects. And I mean, the two institutions that are supporting this, EIB with its hub, or EBRD with their project preparation facility that actually brings human capital to the table, are efficient ones, but they need to be scaled. And it's not only about the money, it's about also the resources to structure these things and make them investable, so people like us can actually pour money into it. The other hurdle is finding the right, but I think the OECD over the past 5-6 years have done a great job at a number of institutions, the MDBs, in looking at blended finance solutions to de-risk investment for such investors. So those things are available. There's almost, I usually say, I think we've been talking about it for the past 10 years. Now it's about doing, and it's about doing at scale. It's let's start running now that we know how to walk.
Before we move on, Kenneth, do you want to defend your idea of a global carbon bank?
Yeah, let me pick up a couple points. First of all, the existing institutions, and let me particularly point to the World Bank, which is by far the biggest, really lack the focus to do this. They're trying to do so many things, trying to please so many NGOs in order to accomplish this mission, and it really does need to be something that's focused. I don't think it can be done within the existing institutions, and I don't think it can be done with private money. I think Mafalda made a very good point. The money doesn't want to go where it's needed. Frankly, after the pandemic, if you watch what's unfolding, we already have a huge number of the poorest developing economies basically bankrupt. But a lot of the emerging markets, some of the smaller ones have already defaulted. The other ones are straining. They're not in a position to draw on the massive foreign funds needed to get to put the numbers that Thierry and others have said. So I do certainly think there's a role for private financing, huge in the advanced economies. But in emerging markets, there really needs to be public money, and it needs to be coming from the richer countries. So I don't really see an alternative to this.
Thierry, you wanted to come back.
Quick one. If you said, for example, the special drawing rights of the IMF could be only used to actually close those coal power plants, I think that could be a very easy way, and you don't have to create a new institutions. So the question is, how do you channel this massive transfer from the West or into emerging markets? I don't think you need to create another institutions, but you need to have clear intentions. And I think that's...
I'm sorry, but I just don't think the IMF has the competency to try to direct something like
give
this.
The money
you can create another institution you fund with the SDRs, perhaps.
All right, you're going to have to agree to disagree on that. This is a good point to say. Don't forget to join the conversation and help spread the word using the hashtag Building the Green Consensus. Thierry, I'm going to read you and, of course, everybody else this. It's a quote from Fatih Birol, Executive Director of the International Energy Agency. If governments are serious about the climate crisis, there can be no new investments in oil, gas and coal from this year. Do you agree with that, Thierry? Do you think governments are really serious about the climate crisis?
I think they are, but they can't make the decisions for most of them. No, I mean, I think, again, this is, it's easier in developed economies to make that clear choice. And I think in Europe, that is pretty much where we are. That it is, I mean, to take a simple example of countries, emerging countries, take Senegal. Today, they have a power capacity which is 60 or 70% heavy fuel. They found gas, and they want to transfer from heavy fuel to gas, which is an improvement. Can we ask them to sort of renounce their industrialization plan and using the gas? It's a big question. So they may be very serious about climate, and they have proved it by going in 5 years to 30% renewable energy capacity. But that's a tricky question. So that's why I don't have a black and white yes or no in this, because it really depends on which side of the fence you are in terms of your affordability.
Well, we'll forgive you for that. Kenneth, another potential hurdle is public debt to GDP ratios, which, of course, have increased massively as a result of the pandemic. And there are real concerns about a sovereign debt crisis in the world's poorest countries. How much do you think it will affect public investments in renewables?
I mean, I think dramatically. I think countries, the poorer countries and the middle income countries have not been able to massively increase their debts in the way that the rich countries have. The markets don't have the appetite. Just one figure I might cite is that if the interest bill in advanced countries has actually been going down despite debts going up because interest rates are zero, that is not the case in the rest of the world. And as I said, I mean, there's much more concern that there's already trouble brewing. So, you know, they don't just need loans, they need aid, grants.
Mafalda, how do you think you can stop huge amounts of government investment from creating a green tech bubble?
I mean, I don't think here we are talking about a risk of a green tech bubble. I think, and what I'm hearing also from my colleagues here, is the massive gap in green investments. And we are pretty good at making the same mistakes. I mean, the mistakes that we made on the aftermath of the 2008-9 crisis, where not just we saw that, you know, who suffered the most were the poor, and what was the percentage of that spending and stimulus that went to green initiatives was less than 20%. Well, this time around is around the same thing, even less than that. Trillions of dollars being invested and less than 20% in green initiatives. And much of this actually is in developed countries. It's not even in developing countries because they don't have the fiscal capacity. And so if we match this with what I was saying earlier on, which is there's a massive infrastructure gap, investment gap in developing countries. They are now suffering the most from the COVID-19 pandemic. They are the most fiscally strained. There's no doubt that there's a need for support in the form of public capital to flow into developing countries to support green investments. So I don't think we have to catch up to the green investments. I don't think there's a risk of a bubble. Right. We are way behind what needs to be done in terms of investments in green technologies.
Right. I mean, let's talk about some of the sort of political fallout, because Pascal, it's been 5 years since we saw Donald Trump elected, Britain vote for Brexit, but the discontent in former industrial areas that helped drive these two shock election results hasn't just disappeared. I mean, in your mind, what's the potential political fallout from closing down fossil fuel industries?
Well, you know, what we are doing in Europe is precisely to try to find a way of the just transition. So with the Green Deal, we have set very radical goals like climate neutrality in 2050, meaning changing a huge part of our economy, mobility, housing, energy, and so on in one generation. But at the same time, setting public money to have a just public policies in place for some groups, for some communities, for some territories, for some value chain that will be negatively impacted by the transition. So we already put 17 billion euros dedicated to a just transition in some countries like Poland, and we for coal, and we will do even more in the new package. So that's exactly the grammar we are in. And so far, so good. And I will give you an example again, which is, to my view, a very good example. It's the car industry. What we have more or less negotiated with the car makers in Europe, so Stellantis, Volkswagen, BMW, Mercedes, Renault, and so on, big names, big brands, is precisely to shift the whole industry in less than 15 years' time. And because now they have the technologies, they know how to do it. We negotiated what is needed for some territories that will be negatively impacted, but all others will be also positively impacted. And then we are building the consensus. It's the heart of our discussion. Okay. We are managing to build the consensus of the huge change in the mobility sector, which is, to my view, a very good example of what should be done at scale, even more largely.
Right. You've also argued, Pascal, that the European Central Bank should abandon market neutrality and take a much more active role in supporting the climate agenda. Let's just take a look at what Christine Lagarde had to say about that earlier this year, speaking to us at another Project Syndicate event.
The short-term costs of the transition pale in comparison to the costs of unfettered climate change in the medium to long run. So it is essential to support and drive an orderly transition to a green economy. The primary responsibility for that action lies with government, who control the most important tools. But it will require effort and commitment from all parts of society, including central banks. And while there is a long road ahead, I believe the necessary steps are clear and progress has already begun.
Pascal, what do you think of that?
Well, it's part of the green consensus in Europe. The new role of the ECB, and of course, Christine Lagarde is leading it. What has changed? Years ago, including from under Mario Draghi, the idea was that it was not in the mandate of a central bank to deal and to care about climate action. What is now the new consensus in Frankfurt and in the European Central Bank's system within the Eurozone is to say, no, it is our mandate. Why? Because climate disruption, so uncontrolled climate change, is a clear threat to financial stability. And financial stability is part of the mandate of the central banks. So decreasing the risk of instability due to climate disruption is part of the mandate. And then once you have changed the mindset, then the ECBs and the others have the tools to do so.
Right. Kenneth, what do you make of that argument? Should central banks go green to help phase out fossil fuels?
Well, first of all, I applaud what the ECB is doing, although I think the argument that it's about preventing financial crises is tortured. The real argument is that the governments, and who really have the power, as Christine Lagarde rightly said, they have made a very clear decision. They have a very clear, coherent policy. And the ECB's role as a regulator, where it really is not so independent, it's independent in setting inflation, as a regulator is to follow suit, to help, to do what it can. We have a problem in the United States. There's no question about that. I mean, you have to understand this is a place where, half of adults practically don't want to take vaccines, talking about, social good. I understand that's controversial, but it's much bigger here than it is in Europe. And you see the same thing in the climate discussion. And yes, the Biden administration has put forward some ideas. They're clearly way more committed to doing something than anything we've seen. But it's a paper-thin majority. It's tied in the Senate. There are a couple votes in the House. It's not a big social consensus. And it's very hard for the Federal Reserve to take the lead in this situation the way the European Central Bank has. It does not have a mandate about climate change. It doesn't have the expertise. If the government says, the Environmental Protection Agency, and there's a very clear long-term coherent path, it's very easy for the Federal Reserve to follow. But on the other hand, if the Federal Reserve just says, well, the government's not doing enough, we're going to take over, we're going to do everything, I mean, very soon it really won't exist as an independent agency. It's not democratically accountable. It doesn't have the power. I laud the goals. I love what Europe's doing. I wish we were doing it. But it's not so easy in a political environment where that consensus doesn't exist.
Right. Can I get your brief reactions to that? Thierry, do you agree? Does Kenneth have a point in terms of the mandate for the Federal Reserve?
Yeah, I don't think the idea of financial stability is so far-fetched. I mean, when we think about, the central bank is supposed to look over the system. And when you think of the ability for investors and the system to actually absorb a number of stranded assets, because the way we're going, if we keep investing the same way, perhaps a good 30% of the asset owned by the asset owners will be stranded by climate issues. And that creates and poses a real threat. So I wouldn't undermine the idea of the stability too much, but I agree that the political and social mandate is not there for the Fed, but it does have an avenue to creep into the subject with real issues on the fact that assets that are subject to climate risk could pose a real issue for the system later on.
Well, we're going to take questions from journalists in just a moment. And I know, Pascal, you were shaking your head while Kenneth was talking there about the mandate in the Federal Reserve. I'll get your reaction at the end. Mafalda, you first.
The reaction to this particular theme
this
here?
idea of central banks having a mandate to push a climate change agenda.
I mean, I think all institutions have a mandate to push for agenda in terms of their mandates and responsibilities. So I would agree with what Thierry just said, and I agree with Kenneth. I mean, in the U.S., it's complex. It's a much more complex political economy to deal with, and it is a fact that one of the things, and I think we are going to see this after COP26, is a push from many to really drive civil society to demand a lot more from governments and private sector leaders, because bottom line, we have already a movement, and the youth has generated a movement, but we need a much more significant movement that can drive change.
Okay, Pascal?
Well, as I said, I mean, now it's part of the what we call the new European consensus. So it's partly in Brussels, partly in Frankfurt when it comes to the ECB. But it has to be in the mandate, because otherwise then we would have a democratic problem. So we want the ECB to do what is in its mandate. And now we have enough studies that connect the climate shocks of an uncontrolled climate change, 5, 6, 7 degrees, and financial instability. Because Thierry mentioned the stranded assets risk, which is one of the consequences of the risk associated to climate change. But then you have the vulnerability risk, the impact risk of climate shocks, concrete for if I take, one concrete example in Europe, the main ports, whether we talk about Rotterdam, Antwerp, or Le Havre, will be underwater in the second part of this century if we do not do anything. So that's systemic. And now it's part of the core of the consensus we are in Europe.
All right.
And that's why the ECB has a legitimacy to act. And by the way, to solve the democratic issue, that's why it's a connection between political action and the ECB action. We do not ask the ECB to say what is green or not. We say it through a text called taxonomy, which is where Europe leads as well. Taxonomy to say, well, it's good to invest in this technology, is not good to invest in this technology.
Okay.
And then the ECB takes this. It's not the mandate of the ECB. They take this and then they apply this compass, I would say, to their own investment and regulatory works. So that's why I think we managed to have the democratic balance quite well managed here.
Thank you for explaining that. It is time now to open up the floor to journalists from around the world. I'm actually going to read this question on behalf of Catherine Duan from Sina Finance, North American Bureau Chief in China. The first question is, the National Carbon Emission Trading Market launched online trading on July the 16th in China. What impact do you think the carbon trading market will have? Is there any difference from the situation in the EU? Does anyone particularly want to take that question? Pascal?
Well, if I may,
yes.
for the time. So first, it's good news. It's very good that we have at least and at last a carbon price and a carbon pricing in China. But the level is very low at that stage. So that's why, as in the EU, we are at 60 euros, so around $70 per ton of CO2. Then we need to put in place something that the US don't like, that China does not like neither, but that's something we are going to do, which is a carbon border adjustment mechanism. Because of course we cannot ask our corporates, our industries to pay 60 euros or $70 per ton of CO2, competing with competitors paying zero. So we have to have just a level playing field to make sure that it is fair for them as well. So it's very good. It's not a game changer yet, but it's a very good starting point.
All right, we're going to take another question, this time from Rhiannon Bartlett Imadagawa, UK correspondent Nikkei in Japan. Rhiannon, your first question.
Thank you. As it's been discussed, many coal power plants in the pipeline are in developing countries in Asia, and it's not really possible to tell them realistically to only use renewable energy at this point. So to bring about the transition to renewables in this context, are G7 commitments and European incentives enough to shift from coal power? Because otherwise, isn't there a global framework needed? Because other countries could just fill the gap.
Mafalda?
Yes, I think, as I alluded to earlier on, I do think that it is possible in many developing countries to meet demand and phase out from coal through renewable energy. But there has to be a significant scale up of investments in renewable energy generation and support to the phasing out of coal in a framework whereby, we don't just look at the assets, but we look at the people and communities, and we look at governance issues. We are putting such an initiative forward. So we are going to be launching an accelerating coal transition investment program for developing countries. I think this is the framework. This is a framework whereby we bring public capital from developed countries, and we with that we look at all of the dimensions of this transition, and we judge what are the types of investments where public capital needs to come in, and what are the investments where private capital comes in, with under a de-risking framework from public capital. But I wouldn't necessarily say that that this isn't possible in developing countries. We work in many developing countries, and they are very keen on moving away to renewable energy and phasing out from coal, but they do need support. And Thierry was mentioning Senegal, and other countries, Pakistan, who has committed to not put up more coal and phase out from coal. But there are alternatives in terms of renewable energy meeting that demand, but these countries need support.
Okay, thank you very much, Rhiannon, for your question. I'm going to read the next question again on behalf of Dr. Olukayode Oyeleye, consulting editor at Business AM in Nigeria. How can, he asks, African leaders promote greener, cheaper source of energy for the continent's poor? Thierry?
Sorry, can you repeat the question slightly at the end of it?
Yes, how can African leaders promote greener, cheaper sources of energy for the continent's poor?
I mean, they are already doing that. I think we shouldn't underestimate the energy, and there is quite a consensus. It's true at the African Union, but it's true with every single head of states that I meet in Africa, and that has really been driven by their own contribution since COP21 with their national contribution. They all have a plan, and also driven by the fact that their natural partners for financing are the MDBs, and the MDBs no longer support anything else but renewable energy. So it's a movement that is really started. And really making good progress in that.
Thierry, thank you. Our next question comes from Bojan Georgievski, editor of Respublika in Macedonia. Your question.
Thank you. My question is, what are some of the game-changer moves that can be taken by smaller and poorer countries across the world that will lead to the greatest results in terms of moving away from overly relying on fossil fuels and also becoming more adaptable to climate changes?
Kenneth, would you like to take that one?
Well, I guess a rather abstract answer to that is that this is an area we need experimentation. We don't know what works. We don't know what's going to get us ahead. And precisely, it's great that in the European Union, this vast group of countries can make a collective, cohesive decision. But I think they've done a great job. But we don't know how it's all going to work out. For example, I raised the nuclear issue earlier. And so, having countries look at each other's experiences, try to see what works. And if I can just go back to having something like the World Carbon Bank, precisely could be a framework for exchanging those ideas.
Thank you very much. Our last question, I think, comes from Michał Sotowski, editor Krytyka Polityczna in Poland. Your question.
Oh, thank you very much.
You're welcome.
I'd like to ask how, that is, with what kind of regulatory and political measures can we assure that the new potential flows of investment in renewable energy would bring about a rather convergence between countries in terms of developing, but also owning and controlling green technologies? Or, in other words, how to prevent Western countries and the developing economies from being divided again into active owners of green technologies and the buyers or passive recipients, those reproducing and increasing economic and structural inequalities?
Anyone like to answer that in particular? Otherwise, I shall pick one of you. Nobody? Yes, go, Kenneth. Go for it.
That's a brilliant question. I mean, so hopefully things will come. Hydro seems like it's always 30 years away, and will be, not hydro. I meant, new technologies always seem like they're around the corner, but not necessarily happen, but they will. And you don't want to get in a situation where there's some Western private company that owns it, becomes some new mega monopoly, and the developing economies are really left, with very little. And I think this is an area where, because of the global nature, it's really like vaccine. There needs to be a way to share. This is very much like the pandemic, but unfortunately worse on a much bigger scale. We need a way to share that we really have not had until now.
Right. I mean, do you want to just pick up on that briefly, Mafalda, that risk, using the comparison of the pandemic in terms of that divide between developed and developing countries and access?
Yeah, I mean, I was mentioning earlier on, I think what we have to realize is that this pandemic, this crisis, unfortunately, I don't have a better way of saying it in English. It's a taste to what might come. Climate change is going to be a much more significant risk, a consistent, systemic risk to the economies and societies in the world. And therefore, I think we really have to realize this, that if we think this is severe, and it is severe, we've had more than 3.5 million people die, and we've lost 3-4 years in terms of poverty reduction, gains in poverty reduction in amongst the poorest countries in the world.
Yes.
This is just, this is small compared to what might come. So we really need to take this risk seriously.
Okay.
I mean, the question that this latest journalist posed is complex. It's going to be dependent on the countries. There's a lot of regulatory and policy changes that are needed depending on the country to really drive the investments. And governments have a critical role to play in terms of climate justice. So I would like to end here, because I don't think we will meet the climate goals if we don't, like Jeffrey Sachs said, if we don't anchor all of this transition in climate justice, I don't think we're going to meet the goals.
All right. Well, Michał, thank you for your question there. That's all we have time for now. Thank you so much to our amazing panelists for taking part. It was a fascinating discussion. We'll be taking a short break. But when we come back, we'll be talking to former Jordanian Prime Minister Omar Azaz and others about what needs to happen to prepare us for living in a warmer world. Also coming up today, we'll have Odile Renaud-Bassot, President of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, in conversation with Werner Hoyer, President of the European Investment Bank. Let's see if consensus breaks out. See you in a minute.
chamo-me Bandi Julião, sou técnico instalador da SolarWorks. As comunidades estão a sofrer devido à falta de energia. Eles podem ficar por mais de 6 a 1 ano sem energia elétrica. Por mais que o distrito tenha energia elétrica, a energia tem tido cortes frequentes e não é tão rentável. A SolarWorks decidiu instalar estes sistemas na perspectiva de ajudar, porque a comunidade sofria por não ter a rede elétrica.
As dificuldades de acesso à energia começam porque a localidade não está ligada à corrente nacional. Teremos iluminação numa primeira fase e também teremos acesso a equipamento eletrônico. Estamos a falar de balanças eletrônicas, estamos a falar de lâmpada ginecológica, estamos a falar da utilização de um computador que já está cá conosco, que era um pequeno constrangimento na sua utilização.
O hospital aqui no distrito é muito longe de Nhaçato, é 53 e poucos quilômetros. Tendo essa unidade sanitária, esse hospital, fica mais fácil, principalmente para mulheres grávidas, porque se nascemos em casa, corremos muitos riscos.
Percebemos cedo que a energia solar era a solução. Esta energia traz mais-valia enorme para as pessoas que vivem em zonas rurais. Algumas delas são pessoas que nem sequer pensavam que um dia pudessem ter energia nas suas vidas.
E esse sistema veio para ajudar. Acredito que a comunidade em geral está muito satisfeita pela instalação do sistema.
İzmir yoğun ve kalabalık bir şehir. İnsanlar sürekli bir noktadan diğer bir noktaya gitmeye çalışıyorlar.
Dikkat, kapılar kapanacak.
Eski metro araçlarımıza göre yeni metro araçlarımız hem yolcularımız için hem de sürücü için daha geniş ve daha ferah.
Hattımızın inşaatı yaklaşık 3,5 yıl sürecek. 1000'in üzerinde personel aktif görev alacak.
Araç sayısını alabilir miyiz? Bu gemiler 80 metre boyunda, daha konforlu. Diğer gemilerden daha büyük. Makinaları daha güçlü. Daha hızlı gemiler. 15 knot seyir hızına çıkabiliyoruz.
Oturma alanları çok daha rahat. Daha verimli yol alıyoruz. Havalandırma sistemi çok daha iyi iç mekanizmada, iç alanda.
Körfez'de bir sıkıntılar oluyor, trafik sıkıntısı, ne bileyim bağırış, çağrışlar, kornalar hep insanları rahatsız ettiği için şu yolu tercih ediyoruz.
Eu chamo-me Bandi Julião, sou técnico instalador da Solar World. As comunidades estão a sofrer devido à falta de energia. Eles podem ficar por mais de 6 a 1 ano sem energia elétrica. Por mais que um distrito tenha energia elétrica, a energia tem tido cortes frequentes e não é tão rentável. A SolarWorks decidiu instalar estes sistemas na perspectiva de ajudar, porque a comunidade sofria por não ter a rede elétrica.
As dificuldades de acesso à energia começam porque a localidade não está ligada à corrente nacional. Teremos iluminação numa primeira fase e também teremos acesso a equipamento eletrônico. Estamos a falar de balanças eletrônicas, estamos a falar de lâmpada ginecológica, estamos a falar da utilização de um computador que já está cá conosco, que era um pequeno constrangimento na sua utilização.
O hospital aqui no distrito é muito longe de Nhansato, é 53 poucos quilômetros. Tendo essa unidade sanitária, esse hospital, fica mais fácil, principalmente para mulheres grávidas, porque se nascemos em casa, corremos muitos riscos.
Percebemos cedo que a energia solar era a solução. Esta energia traz mais-valia enorme para as pessoas que vivem em zonas rurais. Algumas delas são pessoas que nem sequer pensavam que um dia pudessem ter energia nas suas vidas.
E esse sistema veio para ajudar. Acredito que a comunidade em geral está muito satisfeita pela instalação do sistema.
İzmir yoğun ve kalabalık bir şehir. İnsanlar sürekli bir noktadan diğer bir noktaya gitmeye çalışıyorlar.
Dikkat! Kapılar kapanacak.
Eski metro araçlarımıza göre yeni metro araçlarımız hem yolcularımız için hem de sürücü için daha geniş ve daha ferah.
Hattımızın inşaatı yaklaşık 3,5 yıl sürecek. 1000'in üzerinde personel aktif görev alacak.
Araç sayısını alabilir miyiz? Bu gemiler 80 metre boyunda, daha konforlu, diğer gemilerden daha büyük. Makineleri daha güçlü, daha hızlı gemiler. 15 knot seyir hızına çıkabiliyoruz.
Oturma alanları çok daha rahat. Daha verimli yol alıyoruz. Havalandırma sistemi çok daha iyi iç mekanizmada, iç alanda.
Our vessel is about to dock to the pier.
Körfez'de bir sıkıntılar oluyor. Trafik sıkıntısı, ne bileyim bağırış, çağrışlar, kornalar. Hep insanları rahatsız ettiği için şu yolu tercih ediyoruz.
Hello, I'm Jo Coburn. Welcome back to Building the Green Consensus, brought to you by Project Syndicate with support from the European Investment Bank and European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Later on today, we'll have Odile Renaud-Bassot, President of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, in conversation with Werner Hoyer, President of the European Investment Bank. At the same time, we'll be having another conversation online with you, the audience. So do please get involved, be part of it on the hashtag Building the Green Consensus. Now, adapting to rising global temperatures is the subject of this today's second session, Returns on Resilience. Are we doing enough to protect ourselves from not just the worst case climate change scenarios, but even from milder warming? We don't have that piece of film, so I'll get on and introduce our panel. And I'm delighted to introduce the guests who can hopefully unpack that question. First of all, Ekoswahi Iyahen, Secretary General, Insurance Development Forum. Welcome to you. Omar Azaz, former Prime Minister of Jordan. Erion Veliai, Mayor of Tirana. And Barbara Buchner, Director of Climate Policy Initiative. Now, in little over half an hour, we'll be putting questions to them from journalists based all around the world, but you don't need a press pass to be part of this conversation. All that's necessary is a social media account plus the hashtag Building the Green Consensus. Now, let's see if we can show you that film about what will happen with even milder warming.
Historic flooding in Western Europe has now claimed at least 195 lives.
L'accord de Paris est accepté.
A massive wake-up call, widespread devastation and unprecedented extreme weather.
The European Green Deal is very ambitious.
Omar Azaz, can I start with you? Because as far as we could tell researching this programme, the hottest day recorded in Jordan came 1 month into your term of office as Prime Minister, a staggering 49.3 degrees Celsius. Tell us, from the point of view of someone running a country potentially so exposed to extreme weather, why does adaptation matter?
Thank you. This has been a great event, and I've been following it because it matters. It matters to the population of the whole world. Jordan is an example of a small country that has not contributed to the emission of CO2s, but is experiencing all the outcomes, the results, the manifestations in climate change. Water scarcity has been acute and got worse over the last decade. And as you mentioned, we have heat waves, hottest days this past summer, and the summer before when I was Prime Minister. So definitely we're experiencing these manifestations locally at a national level. And we've seen examples that were shown by Project Syndicate of countries dealing with these on a national level. Adaptation is extremely important, yet it's not enough. And the reason I say it's not enough is, one, time is running out. Two, we've witnessed over the last decade or so or more initiatives at global level, national, regional levels, but they tend to be, what they lack is a global structure that makes them binding to the countries and binding to everybody else. So this is a very important session because it talks about adaptation, what communities need, what the private sector can do, what nonprofit organizations can do, nation states can do. But I think we are still missing. Something is missing at the global level that can standardize, create criteria, regulations that are enforceable, that we all be part of. Otherwise, the question mark that you started with, will everybody join in, and will the big actors and big players join in, remains a question mark. I really think we're at a historic moment here.
Right, well, we'll discuss some of those issues you've raised. Before we do, I just want to ask Ekos Wahi to take a look at these pictures, because we heard Omar outlining what's been going on in Jordan in terms of climate change. These pictures show extreme weather events from this year alone around Europe. You'll remember the terrible flooding. You work in insurance. In your view, how well prepared are we for dealing with extreme weather?
So unfortunately, I have to say we are not as well prepared as we need to be. I think that the events that we've seen in Europe, also in the United States and many more developed countries is really, from my perspective, just a convergence with the experiences of many developing countries who have been at the forefront of trying to deal with tropical cyclones, drought events on an annual basis. From the perspective of the insurance industry, this is an issue that that the industry has spoken about for a very long time, and has also rung the alarm bells in terms of what we characterize as the protection gap, which is that we know that we have these disasters occurring on an annual basis. There are significant losses that are incurred, but very little of that loss is actually insured. And I'll give you perhaps a statistic that you might find alarming, which is that for most developing countries, we're talking about 1 to 3% in terms of insurance penetration rates. And that's in stark difference to many developed countries where you're talking about 30, 40, 50% in terms of insurance penetration rates. So what that means is that when you do have these events, they're absorbed by individuals, communities, poor people. They're absorbed by governments who have to take resources from education, health, etc., to fund response. So what we've seen in Germany, the United States, etc., I think is now opening up minds to the idea that this is a serious issue. We are not adapting to the kinds of scenarios that we face when we think about climate change. And there's a real need for a conversation around how do we provide better protection systems, particularly for those people who are most poor and vulnerable, both in developed and also developing countries.
Right, well, Barbara, on that, the adaptation agenda has come to focus heavily on nature-based solutions. Now, for those watching, including me, who don't know what that is, can you explain?
Sure, but maybe just before I go to specifically nature-based solutions, I'd like to give kind of a bigger picture as well, because I think we heard from the other panelists really kind of the urgency, and I think the urgency is particularly strengthened through the COVID-19 crisis, because I want to, before going to the nature-based solutions, really kind of give you a bigger picture of where we stand in terms of finance going towards adaptation.
Yes.
Because we've seen even prior to the COVID-19 crisis that the adaptation finance that was flowing was insufficient to meet the estimated global needs given accelerating climate risks. So what we see is that from hundreds of billions a year globally that are currently aimed at climate action, only 5%, about $30 billion goes towards financing adaptation. And that's far below the expected needs of up to 300 billion annually by 2030. And I think the important part here is also that while there has been a trend of gradually increasing this international public finance in recent years towards adaptation, the early indications that we see seem to indicate that there's a dip as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. And I really think this is something that I'd like to stress, because it is an important call for action and really call for everyone around, across the ecosystem to really work on that. Nature-based solutions is basically trying to find specific ways of increasing the resilience of ecosystems. So let me just give you a couple of examples. So if you look, for example, at mangroves, which are very important in terms of capturing greenhouse gas emissions, like having kind of global mangrove protection or resilient water resources are nature-based solutions, or improving dryland agriculture, or like thinking about, even like more technological solutions like early warning systems or climate resilient infrastructure in the context of the ecosystem. So, and again, I think the point here is, which is why nature-based solutions have actually received so much attention, is that the benefits of investing in adaptation often outweigh their costs. So what we have seen, and there's a recent study by the Global Commission on Adaptation, what we've seen that estimates of investments in these types of solutions actually could generate a 4 times return on avoided costs and non-monetary social and environmental benefits. So let me just leave it here. But again, I think it is important to look at the overarching needs that we see in the context, but then really focus on the benefits and the returns that are actually there.
Right, Arion, just before I come to you, Omar, I just wanted you to get to respond to what Barbara said there. Do you think those sorts of solutions are going to come in time for countries like Jordan?
Absolutely, and Barbara mentioned a scary but unfortunately predictable number, that 5% only of financing, public financing, is of what's committed has been delivered. Now, the question is why? And I think the answer is that when countries act alone without a global structure and a global umbrella that recognizes that this is a global public good, and therefore we need to avoid the typical public good, typical collective action, prisoner's dilemma, free ridership, essentially a country saying, oh, why should I do this? Why not other countries do it instead of me? nesting these types of activities into a global structure is extremely important. So finance will come if we create the standards, environmental regulations, and a global commitment where every country has to join into that. And unless it joins, it does not benefit from these benefits. The same with insurance. The reason we don't have the insurance is we don't have standards that have been approved everywhere for that. But even with that, insurance, I think the point was very important, but insurance typically is for assets, buildings, structures, etc. Heat waves in Jordan aren't hurting assets, they're just killing people who are in the field. And heat wave victims are many more than many folds more than victims that we have seen of hurricanes and flooding.
Okay, well,
they're all important.
Well, that's an interesting point, which I will put back to the other panelists in just a moment. But Ariane, let's get your perspective as a city mayor. I mean, how much of your time on a sort of day-to-day basis goes into dealing with adaptation when compared, for example, to mitigation? I'm sure you do both, but if you could just give us a flavour of that.
Well, I think bottom line is that a lot of these issues, the bucket stops with the mayor. I mean, you can do COP 20 or COP infinity, but in the end of the day, it's going to have to take a mayor in the ground who's going to have to plant the trees, who's going to have to do the riverbeds, who's going to have to do water efficiency, who's going to need to increase the green city cover. So I think including cities in these conversations is absolutely important. And sometimes we go from COP to COP, we do the photo op, and then we forget that there needs to be a transmission belt that gets actually a lot of these commitments into action. And in the last 6 years that I've been mayor, I've seen so many ministers of environment come and go, and yet the transmission belt seems to be missing out. So I think including cities is a smart thing to do, not only because the mayor has to do the final work, but because we are becoming urbanites. More and more people are moving to cities. I run a city that is almost half of the country now. It wasn't like this when I was a 10-year-old boy. But 30 years later, after the transition, the collapse of communism, almost everybody's living in the capital. Half of the economy, but also half of the mentality. And I think we need as much ground in the work, as much work in the ground as we do in these 10 centimeters between our ears where our system of values lies. This appetite for cars, how do we curb it? Are cars a status symbol for much of the global south, or is a means of transport that can become greener and healthier? There's a few things we can do, and this is what we're doing in the city.
Right.
We're putting quotas on how many trees we need to plant every year, and we need to reach that quota, and if we miss a year, we have to make up for it. We are turning fleets to green, and again, with quotas. We're giving tax incentives so that an electric car costs sometimes even cheaper without customs and VAT than a diesel car. We are working a lot with education, particularly of young people. So we start changing habits. And bottom line, we are working with agencies like EBRD and the European Investment Bank on how to make our systems more efficient. When I became mayor, we used to lose 65% in the water. We call it network loss. In the future, we can't afford to lose 65% anymore when every drop of water will count as we head into a warmer climate.
Okay, Ekos Wahi, I'd like to go back to what Omar said about insurance protecting assets is not quite the same as protecting people who are suffering or even dying as a result of extreme events.
Yes, thank you for that. I think that there is often one of the challenges, or I shouldn't say challenges, but I think one of the opportunities actually that we have with insurance is that insurance is built on understanding, right? That means collecting data that would allow for insurers to actually be able to price and understand this risk. When we think about climate change, and particularly in those countries that are most affected, there is a dearth in terms of availability of data and information, but ultimately there's also a challenge in terms of translating that data into risk information that I mentioned earlier that can actually be actionable. And so a lot of the work and the systems that are actually built within the insurance industry in terms of risk management are actually the tools that are required for the challenges that we face today. And so there's a question that was raised earlier in terms about insurance instruments and where they can be used. Looking at health, the former Prime Minister is correct in the sense that health risk is a very complex one. But there are actually solutions where people can actually have coverage in terms of hospitalization in the event of a heat event occurring. In addition to that, there are also very real impacts when you have a heat wave, for example, and it has an impact in terms of a body of water that's used for hydroelectric generation, and that dries up. That has a cascading effect in terms of the availability of electricity. Similarly, in terms of built infrastructure, roads melting as a result of heat waves. So what the insurance industry actually has are the tools, the risk management tools that I think are actually quite intrinsic and important at this time in terms of addressing the adaptation challenge. Because if we don't have those focused conversations, working with governments, with private sector, to try to come to an understanding of what this risk is and how are you financing response to this risk, then we kind of miss the opportunity in terms of adaptation entirely.
Right, well, you mentioned the financing. Barbara, let me just show you this graph, and everyone else, of course, showing the anticipated spend necessary on adaptation and compare it to what's been pledged so far. You can see there's a big gap. Why do you think the funds are missing, and how can they be found?
Yes, and we've been tracking at my organization at the fund since more than 10 years, so I can assure you, unfortunately, the picture is pretty right. Well, and I think the particular picture here is also that the private sector efforts are still missing. I think what we've seen is that particularly tracked private sector financial adaptation remained very low in the years leading up to 2021. And I think some of the reasons why money is not flowing towards adaptation is actually, or has already been mentioned by some of our panelists here. I think one is certainly poor policy environments. I think where the conditions are just unsupportive to adaptation investments, but also undervaluing some of the positive externalities of adaptation finance and, giving too much value basically to the risk, but not really seeing that there is some broader benefits in terms of, benefiting the people, benefiting, the economies more generally. And I think, again, the COVID crisis actually has highlighted this tight connection between, the economies, the people, the social and physical infrastructure, but also kind of the lack of access to finance or to long-term credit for projects that address some chronic physical climate risks. And again, I think I've heard some examples here, and EBRD and EIB certainly are doing a lot in this context. And I think the fourth bucket is what Kuswai has just mentioned. I think the lack of climate data, particularly also in the private sector, through which then to develop the right risk finance instruments. So I think this policy, the knowledge and the risk and viability gaps are important, but we see a lot of positive developments also for private sector adaptation finance mobilization. Again, there have been, I think, a number of also resilience bonds that have been come up. The first one issued by EBRD actually in 2019. And I think just maybe to say, why is it not connecting it to some of the other panelists? I think one of the things is certainly having better typologies and taxonomies to also understand what countries need, what cities need, in order to then really come up and, connect basically the needs to the right offerings. And I think there's an array of financial instruments and business models that actually has emerged over the last years. And I just think we need to do more and increase the visibility of those, increase the awareness across the financial sector, and also build the capacity to really take them forward.
I mean, Erin, you explained and outlined what you're doing at a city level and all the techniques that you're adopting. And you stressed that there are so many people now in Albania moving to cities, to Tirana, for example. But how would you pull in more private sector funds? I mean, are they absolutely core to what you're trying to do in terms of adaptation and mitigation?
No, you're absolutely right. And I think to answer your question, why the funds are not coming as quickly as one would have thought, is because we become a victim of our own metaphors, like the boiling frog. If the frog is thrown into hot water, they immediately jump out. But if the water, gets hotter gradually, you don't. So, many folks from both public and private sector are, victim of this metaphor. They think, 1 degree here and 1 degree there. Well, before when I became mayor the first year, we had a major drought. And most people were saying, well, Mr. Mayor, don't worry about it because it only happens once in 100 years. And then the second year, we went major floods. And again, they were looking at the data. They said, no, it's only once in 100 years with these floods. And then we had snow in the Mediterranean, right? And everybody said, well, this only happens once in 100 years, so don't freak out about it. And then we had a pandemic, which really happens once in 100 years.
Well, let's hope so.
So all of a sudden, this is not funny anymore, because way too many things that in the life of this city only happens once in 100 years happen within my first mandate. So it goes to show that the boiling frog can't go on acting carelessly. So what we're trying to do with the private sector is, like I said, provide incentives. We live in capitalism. Albania tried communism, we failed at it. But in capitalism, it's about incentives. So incentives that we are giving about hydro-isolation and getting housing and building more up to date with the changing climate. Tax incentives for people who are either willing to retrofit, to do solar panels, or to get vehicles that are electric or hybrid, to lower greenhouse gas emissions. I've even looked at cases in the world with a pandemic. There are so many people who believe in anti-vaccine, but once there's a check attached to it, they're actually willing to forget the science and go for the check. So it's about providing incentives. And when it comes to younger generation, it's about emancipation. We started this little habit in which every young person plants a tree for their birthday. Now, for sure, if you plant a tree, you will never cut one. But then you grow up literally, not metaphorically, with roots in the city. And I think the long-term project is to change this 10 centimeters. But until then, it's incentives, and they sure work. And the alibi that people say or people use, that, but we're poor and we can't afford it. I said, no, sometimes it's about making the right decisions. And, things like planting trees or bike lanes or urban planning, designing cities that are more sustainable, are not necessarily expensive. There's, of course, expensive gadgets out there, but common sense is not expensive. And it's just about making the right decisions.
Omar, obviously you've been listening to what Arian's been saying. He's painted a very vivid picture, if you like, of what is happening and what might happen in the future. What do you think about trying to draw more private funds into helping sort this issue out?
Well, first, I think Arian is a great hands-on mayor, and his point about cities have to deliver is absolutely spot on. And I think, but I think he would agree that cities can't act by themselves. Ultimately, you need the type of nesting, if you will, where local communities are empowered, neighborhoods are empowered, the city has its own responsibility, and you go up that sort of pyramid where then there are responsibilities that are beyond the control of cities and have all sorts of effects, spillover effects beyond the city or from other areas into the city. So that's why it's very important that that structure be there. Now, we've tried awareness, nudging, shaming, naming, all of that, and it's important, it's critical, but we have to add to that the types of incentives that Arian was talking about, the standards, the regulations. I'll give you an example from Jordan on health and safety regulations in the construction industry. 20 years ago, so many people were dying on these ladders and in these structures because they didn't have the proper protection. Once these regulations were in, everybody had to abide by them. Now we have very few. So, and that's a global phenomenon, but each country can control it on its own. I think what we need is into that thinking of that nesting is, and you asked a good question, how do we get more private financing? That's not a hard thing, I think. And let me just give you an example. 30 years ago, 40 years ago, most public infrastructure, water, electricity, telecoms, transport, public transport, were all provided by the public sector. But once you created the right structure where private sector comes in with technology, with investment, with operation perhaps, that whole spectrum opened up, and now today it's not odd at all that telecoms and water and public transport are provided with the private sector. What we're missing is that architecture that allows funds and private sector participation, and things like what's being talked about, the circular economy. We need to make sure that producers are responsible for their products, not just until they reach the store shop, but throughout the cycle, so that we make sure that there's a real circular economy and a minimal a throwaway culture, and that has to be all over the world.
Okay, well, just another reminder to all of you watching that we'd love to hear your thoughts too. We really do read every tweet, I promise. So please get in touch using the hashtag #BuildingTheGreenConsensus. Ekoswahi, I just wanted to ask you, insurers naturally have a much stronger business interest in local adaptation efforts than others in the corporate world. In your mind, is there a fundamental problem that other parts of the private sector don't have it in their interest, at least immediate and obvious short-term interest, to grapple with adaptation?
Yes, so it's in the interest of insurers to actually contend with the adaptation question. And I really appreciated the interventions from the last speaker in terms of the importance of public-private partnerships. And that's what really we have been trying to do, which is the industry, as I mentioned earlier in my first intervention, talking about the protection gap, the need for better systems for protecting people, infrastructure, livelihoods, right? And really very limited traction in terms of actually closing this protection gap. And so one of the things that we've actually tried to do is create, again, as was referenced earlier, the architecture that would allow for insurers to engage with the public sector on both sides of their balance sheets in terms of as investors, because they do invest, right? But also fundamentally in terms of underwriting. And so through the work that we are doing with the World Bank and with the United Nations, it's actually built on that understanding of how can we work with these public institutions that many developing countries are actively engaged in terms of their public financial management systems to imbue a better sense of risk management, but also to drive the kinds of innovative products that are needed and which insurers also need in order for the insurance to be a viable proposition in many of these contexts. And I'll perhaps share one example where in the case of the Caribbean, you had hurricanes, and we all know hurricanes pass through the region on a year in, year out basis. And these countries are affected, significant damage, but really had great difficulty in terms of accessing international capacity at an affordable rate. And so what they did was to pool their risk into a single portfolio, and also using some of the innovations that we have in the industry in terms of parametric insurance in order to access reinsurance capacity at a much more affordable rate. And so that was also a system that was structured in a way where you would have this event, but governments could immediately get injection of liquidity within 2 weeks of that event occurring, as opposed to waiting 6 months, 9 months after a disaster has occurred. And so that was particularly remarkable when you think about how insurance can be leveraged in a really innovative way to provide an injection of liquidity that many governments often need. A second tier of innovation that we've seen with that, especially in the African continent, is many governments taking that innovation and saying, can we proactively link the insurance to response mechanisms before an event occurs? So in other words, rather than sitting back and waiting for the disaster to occur, to actually link their contingency plans to say, if I had a drought event and I know that there's a particular region of the country that's going to be affected, can I put in place systems so that as soon as the event occurs, we can get resources to people before they start taking children out of school and undertaking negative coping mechanisms? And again, this is about how do we reduce the impact of these events, but how do we deepen understanding of the risk and better risk management in our government system?
Well, as you say, you're talking about the anticipation of these events that are happening, as Ariane said, more regularly than they used to, for all the reasons that you suggest. Barbara, can I get you to look at these charts? They show vastly more climate finance has gone to mitigation rather than to adaptation. Is that necessarily a bad thing?
Well, I think it is, in the sense, it's not necessarily a bad thing, because again, I think what we've seen in tracking climate finance over the last 10 years is that there has been a steady upward trend. And obviously it is important to do that both on the sectors that are related to mitigation and on adaptation side. I think what the problem is that just the trend on the adaptation side is much lower. I think what we know that obviously, if we meet, if governments, if everyone meets the goals that are embedded in the Paris Agreement, then we will also need, less kind of adaptation going forward. But we also know that we are beyond the point of no return, and that the planet is warming. So there will be, nonetheless, in any case, there will be, adaptation measures needed. So I think the problem here is that we just need to really further scale adaptation. I think there is, issues also around methodologies and on how to track and how to understand the adaptation finance, but there is certainly action missing. So what we need is to really scale it up, and I think we need to use public finance much more effectively to unlock private investment. And I think, again, just what others said, this public-private partnerships is extremely important. And I think there is lots happening, but we really need to be much more careful and how we can actually, use the public money to really kind of cover some of the risks and the areas where the private sector just isn't ready to come in yet. And I think Ekos mentioned some of the innovative financial instruments that are out there, but we need to do that much more at scale.
Okay, I mean, Ekos Wahi, can I just get you on that to respond to what Omar has been suggesting throughout this discussion, which is a global structure, some sort of standard, a set standard for regulations. Would that improve the flow of finance and the commitment to the sort of adaptation and mitigation that you talked about?
I think that there is space for a global, I don't know if it is a compact or agreement in terms of how do we more proactively address around adaptation, right? But I also think that there is space for national action, right? And then there is space for different ways in which we can drive progress with this agenda. Certainly at a global level within the UNFCCC, I have seen over the last decades that I've been involved in this space, the remarkable rise of conversations around adaptation. There's also the Warsaw International Mechanism on Loss and Damage, where adaptation is also a major part of that conversation. But there is a lot more needed in terms of concrete commitments and delivery on those commitments from developed countries to developing countries, because at this rate, we are not seeing any movement, and the outcomes, as we all know, are tragic and will be tragic for many.
Right, Ariane, can I just get your reaction to that, but also whether you see a much greater role for citizens at a sort of ground level in trying to drive some of these initiatives and also public-private partnerships?
Well, I mean, on the first question, I'm an optimistic by nature, but the signs are just not there for this type of. We're seeing that even the existing alliances are getting looser rather than firmer, and we're seeing that countries are backing towards interests of the day or geostrategic interests, and not necessarily the global good. I'm curious to see how the UN General Assembly will go on this week in New York, and it appears that everybody's prepared to make these big pledges, but follow-up, I think, is the question. Just to give you one idea, we had these 2 earthquakes in 2019, while the local and central Albanian government have already funded, and I'm already opening the schools. Most of the money pledged from those early days from big rich donors has not even started being processed yet. So the level of bureaucracy and the heavyweights are acting like 18-wheelers, taking forever to make these turns. But just to give you an illustration from a hands-on experience on how long it actually takes to deliver from the rich to the poor, even when it comes to emergency relief aid, like helping with an earthquake situation. So my second answer is yes, I do rely more on the average citizen to take charge, to live lives that I think are in line with the mission of keeping the climate cooler. I get excited, coming here back to the office. There was a traffic jam in the bike lane, which didn't happen before. It was completely uncool to be with a bike, post-communist Albania. So counting on kids to plant trees and on people to save water, and counting on people to look after each other by living a lifestyle that is adequate to these types of changes, I'd hedge my bet on that more than on the rich helping the poor, which sounds like a noble idea, but even when it happens, it takes forever.
Well, I've taken to my bike too, coming to work. So there you go. Now, Omar, Jordan, something very particular to Jordan, is home to millions of refugees. So let's take this conversation down to a very practical level for a moment. We can see pictures here and ask how, in practical terms, we can bring in the money for climate adaptation that will help the futures of the people that we can see in these pictures.
Well, Jordan today hosts 20% of its population are refugees. This is how large these numbers are. And we've learned in terms of hygiene, in terms of water, in terms of electricity, health, and education. We've learned the hard way how to deliver that, especially for children, where Jordan is committed that no child be left behind, regardless of their country of origin. That's a very tough challenge, but we're taking it very seriously. Now, this is something might be seen as unique to a few countries, but with all the indications of floods and drought, we're going to see much more migration into the cities and sometimes across countries, across borders. So that's another global public good issue that's not being addressed. Who should bear the cost for that? Jordan was supported in the first few years of accommodating refugees, but there's this such thing called as donor fatigue. Well, I understand that, but if the donors were fatigued, we were exhausted. And we were making a long-term commitment. We hope they would go back to their countries, but unless the situation there permits them, they're staying in Jordan, and that's our humanitarian role. But it's a global public good that if this is to happen more, countries really need to be compensated for that. And if I may just say a few things about the what was discussed. The mitigation versus adaptation.
Yes.
I definitely think we need to focus on adaptation much more. The one form of adaptation that we should be careful about and avoid is the one that basically transfers the problem from one place to another. And there are examples of technologies that are not solving the problem, but simply shifting it. And we don't want to get into the NIMBY, not in my backyard situation, and simply have poorer countries bear the brunt of the work. The issue of social, the role of citizens is crucial. Citizen awareness is very important, and taking action and responsibility for their actions is crucial. We've seen social entrepreneurs doing incredible things. So what I would add to the PPP, public-private partnership, is a C, public-private civic partnership, because they're really delivering on all sorts of results in amazing ways.
Okay, we're going to open up the discussion now to journalists from around the world. I'm going to read this question on behalf of Catherine Duan from Sina Finance, North American Bureau Chief in China. What are the main challenges, she asks, that you have seen to address in moving towards a low-carbon economy? Barbara.
Well, I do see, I think the challenges is really moving from kind of a narrow approach in what am I doing for myself to kind of the scale. I think what we've seen a lot is that, we continue to see innovative financial instruments. We continue to see great case studies of specific cities that manage to go towards a more, sustainable kind of pathway. But I think what is really missing is how can we go from the very good pilots and the very good best practices that we see across mitigation and adaptation, how can we get to scale? What is needed in order to really make sure that, there is, the scale and the speed that we need at the moment in order to get there. So I think, some of the elements that we've heard in terms of having the right policy environments, but having also accountability and integrity and really making sure that you measure progress, that you have a chance to really understand how we are moving across the public and private sector is extremely important. And I think the other thing is I think we need a whole of government and cross-sectoral approach. I think there has been too much work in silos, both within governments, but also within the financial community, in various, coalitions and silos from different types of actors. But I think what we need is really kind of collaboration and talking together in order to make sure that the sums of the many initiatives really get us towards a more sustainable future.
Response from you, Arion, on that?
Well, the biggest challenge is cities have fantastic ideas. Access to finance. Most cities have to provide a sovereign guarantee. So they have to go through central government. And usually, in this day and age, central governments are already topping up their loaning capability. So what we're experimenting with the EBRD and the European Bank is that cities should be direct loaners, and we should be able to access finance directly. If cities have their bookkeeping all right, I think the old way, we're still doing loaning to cities like we were doing in the 60s and the 70s. So everything is modernized except for the way we give out loans. And I think for us, since the journalist has a finance background, that's our number one challenge.
Arion, thank you for that. Let's take another question, this time from Rhiannon Bartlett Imadagawa, UK correspondent, Nikkei, Japan. Your question.
Thank you. Financial services and banks in Europe are increasingly considering climate change to be a significant risk for business and will not fund certain projects. Is it time for industry-wide regulations and standards relating to assessing climate change risk? And by when will there need to be such a system to meet environmental targets?
Right. Well, we have discussed this a little bit, but more directly, Ekoswahu.
Yes, I think that we are actually seeing some of the, financial institutions taking this on in terms of, for example, the IMF now considering climate risk in terms of its portfolio. But you're absolutely right in terms of the impact that this is going to have. And one of the things that we have actually been trying to do within the IDF is encourage greater transparency around this risk so that people can have greater certainty in terms of how to deal with it or how it is being managed. So I do think that this is an area that's top of mind for a lot of public officials, but also a lot of private sector actors in terms of how they deal with this particular problem.
Rhiannon, thank you for your question. I'm going to read the next one too. This one is from Dr. Olukayode Oyeleye, consulting editor, Business AM in Nigeria. His question is, what sort of incentives would be needed to discourage further deforestation and promote reforestation in Africa? Barbara, one for you.
Sure, and just to add to the last question as well, I do think we need mandatory reporting. I think, it's fantastic to have a lot of voluntary initiatives, but I do come back to, what we heard also before. I think we need something more mandatory that we can really kind of progress. On the deforestation, I do think we need to come up with the financial instruments and business models that really value, keeping forests in the ground, and that the value basically that the additional benefits that forests have apart from just the timber. And we've been working basically within an incubator program that we run at CPI, where we really come up with some of these financial instruments that can help bring up the business models that can become commercial viable over time and really attract kind of basically private investors to help keep forests intact and help keep kind of the sequestration of greenhouse gases by trees basically intact. So what we need again is go from some of these pilots from this kind of specific financial instruments, and there's one, Komaza actually in Kenya, where they're having a fantastic business model that really works. But how can we go from the specific ways of actually keeping trees basically intact and forests intact and bringing kind of a specific value also to private investors? How can we go from these pilots to scale? So I think we need to think much harder on how can we aggregate some of this smaller scale projects and really make them really attractive to some of the larger kind of investors, and in this way really make sure that we kind of just value more of the benefits that these types of ecosystems have.
Barbara, thank you for that. Let's go to Bohan Georgievsky, editor at Respublika in Macedonia. Your question, please.
Thank you. A question for Mr. Arian. What are some of the crucial steps that can be replicated by countries surrounding Albania that would lead to them becoming more climate change resilient?
Yeah, thank you for your question. I was just in Skopje and Tetovo the other week, and some of the problems are cut and paste. This obsession for cars needs to be mitigated. We are a high immigration to Western Europe, and I think for way too long, one way to show off to your neighbors that you made it in Germany or in Italy is to come back with a junk Mercedes or Fiat and turn the Balkans into a junkyard of fuel inefficient cars and using every public space as a pedestal. You know, all of our sidewalks, all of our lanes, all of our parks. This obsession has to stop. And I think it's not about drawing lines in the streets. It's about fixing these 10 centimeters. This is where we park our ideas. And I think that needs to change. Putting quotas absolutely helps. We were, as you know, you live in the Balkans, we try to tease and troll anyone with an idea. When we were the first city to put a quota of planting 2 million trees by 2030, everybody started to laugh. It said, the funny mayor with a shovel. Now that Milan has a quota of 3 million trees by 2030 and other cities are doing, London wants to be a park city. Paris is doing the 15-minute city, which in the Balkans would work very well because within 15 minutes from where we live, there's a coffee house, a supermarket, the barber, the pharmacy. So it's about time to cherish some of our old ways, which were actually environmentally a lot more friendly. Things like stopping the use of plastic bags, it just takes the signature of a mayor. Things like bike lanes, they don't need a big referendum. So I think we need to be bold, and cities need to be pressured to deliver, in the Balkans too.
Bohan, thank you very much for your question, and Arian, your answer. Final question from Michał Sutowski, editor Krytyka Polityczna in Poland. Go ahead.
Thank you again. I'd like to ask a question that can seem maybe slightly controversial and maybe political, but still. What is to be done, actually, if some country is ruled by a group of people or a figure that is openly in denial of climate change, of climate crisis, especially if this country is ruled in an authoritarian or semi-authoritarian way? Should you, in your opinion, the private sector, which is interested in investment in adaptation and climate mitigation projects, try to either bypass the national authorities in some way, or rather it could or it should actively support, let's say, the regime change in that country? Do you think it's a viable option for the private sector?
Yeah, well, that is a provocative question. Omar?
That is a great question. Let me start with a concrete example in a different sector, trade, global trade. There's something today called the World Trade Organization, WTO, and it's an effective organization that makes sure that everybody plays by the rules, or else there are punishments, there are consequences to states acting out of the rules that have been established collectively for trade. Now, it's ironic and I think sad that WHO does not cover issues of environment, and labor, perhaps, so that we have a level playing field between countries, not just trade regulations. So this is a long way of getting back to the question. Human rights are extremely important, and there are countries that are sort of authoritarian or even democratic, but dysfunctional democracies where you have people very short-term oriented, without a structure that nudges them to play by the rules, or else there would be consequences. We're not going to address this problem at all of climate change. The CO2 emissions are a global public good, unless everybody knows that everybody's in it together. And if you're out, there would be consequences. And it's much better to join in than to stay out of it and play by those rules. it's not going to happen. And some people might say it's so far-fetched, and it is not easy. But I think we're at a historic moment, not dissimilar to the creation of the nation state itself in the 17th century. And for the last 200 years, the idea of a nation state, of a country, has become standard. In the 1920s, the League of Nations started with 20 countries, and it sounded ridiculous and undoable. In the 1945, we had the UN established, and at the time, only 50 countries, I think, joined it, and then took a while for others. I think the time is pregnant today for a structure, whether it's through the World Trade Organization and expanding its mandate, or an organization that looks at country behavior and whether they're dumping environmental consequences and spillovers on others, or they are, in the opposite of that, actually taking initiatives. And there has to be that sort of structure.
Michal, thank you for your question, and Omar, thank you for your response. That's all we have time for now, I'm afraid. Thank you so much to our fantastic panellists and questioners for taking part. Still to come in the final stages of today's event, we'll have Odile Renaud-Basso, President of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, in conversation with Werner Hoyer, President of the European Investment Bank. Stay tuned for that, but that's all from us for now. See you in a minute.
chamo-me Bandi Julião, sou técnico instalador da Solar World. As comunidades estão a sofrer devido à falta de energia. Eles podem ficar por mais de 6 a 1 ano sem energia elétrica. Por mais que um distrito tenha energia elétrica, a energia tem tido cortes frequentes e não é tão rentável. A SolarWorks decidiu instalar estes sistemas na perspectiva de ajudar, porque a comunidade sofria por não ter a rede elétrica.
As dificuldades de acesso à energia começam porque a localidade não está ligada à corrente nacional. Teremos iluminação numa primeira fase e também teremos acesso a equipamento eletrônico. Estamos a falar de balanças eletrônicas, estamos a falar de lâmpada ginecológica, estamos a falar da utilização de um computador que já está cá conosco, que era um pequeno constrangimento na sua utilização.
O hospital aqui no distrito é muito longe de Nhansato, é 53 e poucos quilômetros. Tendo essa unidade sanitária, esse hospital, fica mais fácil, principalmente para mulheres grávidas, porque se nascemos em casa, corremos muitos riscos.
Percebemos cedo que a energia solar era a solução. Esta energia traz mais-valia enorme para as pessoas que vivem em zonas rurais. Algumas delas são pessoas que nem sequer pensavam que um dia pudessem ter energia nas suas vidas.
E esse sistema veio para ajudar. Acredito que a comunidade em geral está muito satisfeita pela instalação do sistema.
İzmir yoğun ve kalabalık bir şehir. İnsanlar sürekli bir noktadan diğer bir noktaya gitmeye çalışıyorlar.
Dikkat, kapılar kapanacak.
Eski metro araçlarımıza göre yeni metro araçlarımız hem yolcularımız için hem de sürücü için daha geniş ve daha ferah.
Hattımızın inşaatı yaklaşık 3,5 yıl sürecek. 1000'in üzerinde personel aktif görev alacak.
Araç sayısını alabilir miyiz? Bu gemiler 80 metre boyunda, daha konforlu. Diğer gemilerden daha büyük. Makinaları daha güçlü. Daha hızlı gemiler. 15 knot seyir hızına çıkabiliyoruz.
Oturma alanları çok daha rahat. Daha verimli yol alıyoruz. Havalandırma sistemi çok daha iyi iç mekanizmada, iç alanda.
Our vessel is about to dock to the pier.
Körfez'de bir sıkıntılar oluyor. Trafik sıkıntısı, ne bileyim bağırış, çağrışlar, kornalar. Hep insanları rahatsız ettiği için şu yolu tercih ediyoruz.
Hello again, I'm Jo Coburn and welcome back to the third and final session today where we'll be hearing from Odile Renaud-Bassot, President of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development, in conversation with Werner Hoyer, President of the European Investment Bank. Now, in today's final session, we'll be asking why public finance matters. Where are the gaps in the free market that public money may need to fill in the fight against climate change? If you've got thoughts on that or any of the other topics that have been raised today, what could be better than whipping out your phone and sharing them with us using the hashtag Building the Green Consensus. Now, without further ado, the moment you've been waiting for. A few days ago, European Investment Bank President Werner Hoyer sat down with fellow President Odile Renaud-Bassot of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development to tackle the big questions at the heart of this session.
Good morning, Werner. I'm very happy to have the opportunity to have this conversation with you. I think this is in the context of a joint event our bank are organizing. And I think this is a very timely moment because we are all thinking and heading towards COP26. We just come out from a period where we had the extreme climate event. I think the summer was extremely challenging in a number of places in the world, from Canada to Europe to America, and I think that the issuance of the IPCC report a few weeks ago is also really sounding the alarm and showed how quickly things are evolving, how clear also the science is about what are the challenges, the reality of the impact of human activity on the climate change, and the fact that things are moving much more quickly than what we expected, and that there is really a sense of urgency for action now. So I think this is really the right time to exchange about what we can do about that and what we could expect, what we should expect from COP26. And in my view, maybe to start, I think there are 4 or 5 issues that would be very important in this context of the COP26 and the capacity to be able to deliver. The first one is to have trust and to build confidence between the parties. And we know that there are contentious issues, there are a common but differentiated responsibility, but I think the world will manage this only if everybody is on board and it's playing its role, making its part, and deliver on its commitment. The second element, which is very important in my view for the success of COP26, is to have ambitious commitment from all the countries. A lot of countries have already issued some NDCs, so national determined contribution, but we can see that the level of ambition is not sufficient. Overall, some countries are doing better than others, but I think the overall level of ambition is not there yet, and we need to step up. The third element, I think it's, in my view, very important to have a long-term objective, this commitment to net zero in 2050. But what is also extremely important is action in the short term. And the more quickly we act, the more we will be effective in addressing increase in temperature, the less we will need to have adaptation action. So I think this is key to act and to take steps now, having in mind the long-term objective, but really to accelerate decarbonization. And the last point I wanted to make is public money will be important. I'm sure we'll come back to that. The action of public institutions is very important and can play a big role. But what is also very important is to get all economic players aligned on this objective. And this implies to have the right market signals, to have clear and convincing market signals that will show the way and trigger some action from the private sector. I mean, this is my view, but I would be very happy, Werner, to hear from you also what are, from your perspective, the key elements coming, looking forward to the COP26.
Bonjour, Odile, and thank you for making this possible. It's wonderful to see you. And basically, we could end the meeting here now because I'm subscribed to everything you have said. So I think we are totally aligned there. I'm very grateful to the UK presidency of COP26 also for putting pressure on the MDBs, because I believe that we need to get all multilateral development banks on board on this issue. Time is running out, as we have just heard from the UNFCCC report. We are playing our part. We have full alignment with the Paris goals since the beginning of the year. And we have committed to support $1 trillion of investments by 2030. By 2025, already 50% of our investments in climate action. Presently, it's 40%, so we are on the way there. We are still ambitious to do considerably more, and I think we'll get it done. And yes, totally subscribe the point on the private sector. We will achieve the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations, including the climate goals, only if we crowd in the private sector more. We are presently doing roughly 60% of all our business with the private sector, and more than half of our activity in this field of climate is already private sector today. So we can expand that over the next years even more. We do it in 3 ways. On the one hand, we support and finance innovators, creative innovators. We are in support of incubators of finance and ideas. And of course, we are in an extremely good exchange with the asset holders, where a lot of things have changed over the last years. 5 years ago, it would have been impossible to go to Davos and talk to private asset holders and inviting them to finance climate projects. This has totally changed. So they are ready. And I think in some cases, the private sector is even ahead of the public sector.
I do completely agree with you on the readiness of the private sector and on the fact that there is some appetite. And it's very clear from the big asset managers, they are looking for a project in which to invest. And that's why I think one very important component also is to develop, to drive policies so as to make markets, to create market for green and sustainable investment. And in a way, I think this is very much something on which MDBs can act. So not only providing financing and financing project, which is indeed, at the core of our activity, but one very important dimension also, in particular in this climate change, to deal with this climate challenge, is to ensure that we mobilize all our competencies and our knowledge to support the countries to design and to define the right policies. Because I think that this is the experience we have, for example, in a number of countries. Having the right regulatory framework, having the right market organization is extremely important to be able to attract investment in renewable, for example. Of course, we are also doing a lot with our financing. As Werner was saying, for the EBRD, the objective is also to have 40% of all our financing in the green area. We will be at 40% or maybe slightly above in 2021. And we have this objective of 50% in 2025. And the other very big, important element driving our financing and the project we support is the commitment to be fully Paris-aligned by the end of 2022, which means, as is the case for the EIB, that we look at each and every project to be sure that this is consistent with the objective of the Paris Agreement.
Well, as a shareholder of EBRD, I might say that I'm very happy that we are obviously on the same track and that we are sharing the objectives. So let's work on it together, and let's not hesitate also to bring the message to the other MDBs.
No, I think that's very important. What is also important in the work among MDBs is to agree on common methodology. I think that in the climate challenges, one of the big issues nowadays is to have common terminology, common definition, and this is true for the private sector. There is a lot of work on taxonomies and having sort of same kind of reference when we decide that something is green or not.
I strongly support your words on alignment of definitions and criteria and methodology, because we are not there yet, to be quite honest. We have international institutions who consider a climate project which other institutions would never consider ambitious enough to be considered a climate objective. So we have to align these definitions and criteria. And this is why I welcome so much the work going on the taxonomy, because if we really want to crowd in the private sector and the private investors to give us their money, then we must make sure that they can rely upon the content of the projects they finance together with us. So I totally welcome this. And this will be particularly ambitious and difficult in the context of adaptation, because we both participated last week in Rotterdam at this impressive event with King Willem-Alexander and Ban Ki-moon on climate adaptation. And there we must, I think, still do considerably more. We must step up our efforts. And you are totally right that this involves also more alignment on the question of measurement and taking into account climate risks. I think we should also work on issues like knowledge gap. We need to overcome the knowledge gaps and support clients and private businesses in understanding and dealing with climate risks and opportunities, by the way. We must also, I think, try to bridge the huge finance gaps. The investment needs are enormous. So we are talking about quantum leaps in the need for much higher volumes. And finally, we must concentrate a lot of our work on the green transition, because we have regions, areas, and social parts of our societies which are particularly challenged by the transition to more climate change adaptation. So it's a lot to do, and I think that the institutions in London and in Luxembourg can cooperate very well on this.
Oh, yes, I completely agree with you on these two issues of adaptation, technology, and green transition, and just transition. And let me come back on these elements. I think on adaptation, I was really struck by the discussion we had on last week on the need that there is, it's not a trade-off between mitigation and adaptation. I think we need to do both. Now it's clear that in any case, there will be an increase in temperature. It's already taking place, and therefore adaptation is absolutely key. And on adaptation, we will need some public money, but we need also to bring the private sector on financing resilience in the countries in which, in all countries of the world. And adaptation is particularly challenging in Africa, but it's also, a challenge everywhere. For example, as I was saying, we intervene a lot in Central Asia, and in Central Asia, glaciers are really melting down, and this has an impact on the stability of access to water, geopolitical impact, energy source, and so forth. So the increase of temperature will have a huge impact on all the stability of the regions. And this is also related to just transition, because for a number of countries, but also for people in some countries, the impact of the transition is huge. We can see areas, we are working in countries where coal is still 70% of the source of energy. So if you decide to close the coal mining, this has a huge impact on some people, some region, and so forth. And we need to accompany that with reskilling, new investment, and so forth. We have an example in Poland, where in a region where coal industry is closing, creation of a new battery industry, which is the future for storing electricity and therefore being able to use more renewable and so forth.
Clearly, from the beginning, just transition was a cornerstone of our activities on the way to the climate change roadmap that we have developed and decided. But we must also be quite clear that the success of all our activities and efforts on climate change will not only depend on what we do in Europe, but what we do beyond. And you are right, we must help the developing countries, but I don't see this only as a challenge. I only see this as a huge opportunity, because it will, for instance, be decided in Africa whether the sustainable development goals, at least the climate ones, will go up in smoke, or whether we'll succeed in bringing top technologies to Africa in order to come up with clean energy solutions. And we need lots of more electricity in Africa, for instance. That needs to be done with the best technologies, and they can be offered by Europe. So we should be much more outgoing in our efforts. And since we have been present in Africa for the last 60 years, I think we have a very good basis for that. We need to strengthen that leg on which we are working, and we will.
On this issue of technology, I think that, as I was saying, the situation is evolving. Hydrogen, electricity storage with batteries and so forth. And this will be important to make further progress, because we know that now renewable is a very important source of energy, in some cases extremely cheap. And that's something which I think is sometimes underestimated, that in a number of countries, the cheapest source of energy is renewable, be it solar, wind, hydroelectricity. So this is very promising for the future. But still, the challenge is intermittence, the need to have grids, adequate grids, but also the capacity of storage, which is still not completely up to the, completely satisfactory. So I think we need to continue, research investment there, and in between, in the short term, this triggers the issue of how to accompany countries for which renewable cannot completely be the only answer. In some countries, we still see the case, while, if in the context of a clearly Paris-aligned strategy and so forth, to have some transitory role for gas, for example. And this is something on which I think we do not have completely the same approach between the two institutions. I think we have complementary approach, but this is, in my view, quite important if we want to move quickly to decarbonization, while of course being completely consistent with Paris. What we need to do to be Paris aligned, I think, is to, first of all, ensure that all our projects are consistent with the Paris Agreement, which is they do not harm, they are not against, some can support the decarbonization and so forth. So we will have to do that. And we committed to do that by end of 2022. And one important dimension I forgot to mention is also to ensure that our clients in their own governance take these issues of green transition very seriously. And this is something in which we will invest more and more to ensure that they have the right our clients have the right frameworks to deal with this issue, if only measure their impact, but also take action to address their carbon impact. So I think this is something which will be very structural work, but very important moving forward.
Well, thank you very much. This has been a great exchange already, and I'm encouraged by what my colleague in London has just said. We need to see this as a huge challenge, and we must be ambitious. The window that we still have open in order to reach the climate goals is closing. This is the last decade. The next 5 years are the last 5 years where we have the opportunity to change the trend. And this is why we must think innovation, climate, and development in a context. And we must get ahead of the curve. And therefore, we have decided, for instance, to get out of fossil fuels completely. And on the other hand, we take both parts of the term just transition seriously. Just, yes, we must help those people who are leaving the coal mines now in parts of Europe, for instance, in the world, which need to be closed soon. But it's transition, and it's nothing that should be perpetuated. Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure to be with you, Odile, and with our audience.
Thank you very much, Werner.
Well, thank you so much to both Werner Hoyer and Odile Renaud-Bassot for such a fantastic, illuminating discussion. That's all we have time for. There's just time left to say thank you once again to all our contributors for taking part, to the team behind the scenes, and as ever, most of all, to you, our audience, all over the world, for watching. I'm Jo Coburn, and that was Building the Green Consensus, brought to you by Project Syndicate, with support from the European Investment Bank and European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. Bye-bye.